Hi, I'm Layman Pascal, and this episode is entitled, What Does It Mean to Say There Is No Evolutionary Relationship? The phrase plays on the work of infamous French psychoanalytic philosopher and cryptic quasi-surrealist Jacques Lacan, who said, Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, which is typically translated into English as there is no sexual relationship. Although, of course, there's some wiggle room between relationship and rapport. This little analytic aphoristic hieroglyph is usually taken as suggesting there's some intrinsic structural antagonism and asymmetry in the relations between men and women, between types of desiring, and even some deep limit on our fantasies of the mutually satisfying reconciliation of opposites. Now, I've substituted the word evolutionary because I want to explore the ways in which thwart, cancellation, parallax, asymmetry, incompleteness, and negation might play a role in how we think about both personal and socio-historical development. There seem to be different layers, phases, or styles of human cognition and different cultural, technological, and economic operating systems that have emerged or unfolded at different times and in different parts of our lives. Are all these symbolic orders constituted by hidden structural antagonisms? Do they differ in how that occurs? Are all ideologies the same, or do they have a developmental history in which we can participate in making a better story? Ontario philosopher Cadell joined me last time to discuss Zizek Hegel and the resonances between self-relating negation and non-dual spirit. We're pleased to have him back to explore what it might mean to say there is no evolutionary relationship and how the incommensurability symbolized by sexual rapport operates in us psychologically, sociologically, historically, and maybe even spiritually. Hi, Cadell.
How's it going, Layman? That was, again, quite a nice info. The possibility for our conversation rest on the non-relation. Let's say the non-sexual relationship. And it's a very complex topic. So yeah, if you want to give a little bit of background, or I can give background, that's fine.
Yeah, I was going to suggest give us a little bit of your history with this. Like, how do you come across this idea?
Sure.
And what's your current understanding of what it means?
So I guess I can approach it two ways. The first way maybe I'll approach it is I'll approach it from like a mystical angle. The first way I'll approach it from a mystical angle is sort of the effect that exposure to psychedelics had on me. Specifically, my first contact and serious work with psychedelics was ayahuasca, and it was in the context of religious community. And I was being held in that space, which I think is important. Like I wasn't like at a party setting or something like that. I was in a proper spiritual container. And I think what was mediated in that experience was, you can put many symbols on it, but it was, experience of God or an experience of some other state of consciousness, which was radically different from the world and radically different from my normal conceptions of self. And in that state of consciousness or whatever it is, I think it's marked or structured by a noticeable lack of desire in the sense of I'm already there. Like there's a marked, overwhelming presence of I had this feeling of I'm not only am I already there, but like wherever I am right now, I could just stay here in a self sort of symmetrical way, and that this is sort of like my natural home. That's at least how I reflect on the experience in my trip reports or something like that. Now, I've come to interpret that from my normal consciousness, almost as if my normal states of desire in my normal consciousness are in relationship to the absence of that. So when I desire as an individual in a historical process, that desire is almost like a placeholder. It's being caused, and it's a placeholder for the absence of that state. That's how I'm sense of it in a mystical sense. However, what that means in a mystical sense is that there's a type of constitutive non-relation. There's a constitutive absence. I do not have sort of like, I can't just press a button or have an app or have some sort of mechanism either through meditation or through some other spiritual technology to just get back to that state of consciousness. where there's sort of no desire, or I'm just already there. Now, I would say the psychedelics have, and actually I told my brother this yesterday, that the main impact that psychedelics have had on my personality is, I think, a type of influence of that state being kind of like I'm already there, in a sense of like, I think the very structure, the goal structure of my consciousness is different. Just having had contact with that state, meaning like, I think if I had never done psychedelics, I think much more of my personality or my ego would be like dependent on like success in a hierarchy. For example, like I would have a goal structure in my head of like, I should become a professor at this age, and like I should have social recognition at this, on this timeline. I think psychedelics disrupted that significantly, and I'm very grateful that I'm able to have contact with a type of already there-ness, which I can sort of work with and develop with in a meaningful sense. But there is the type of way in which I, of course, still struggle with my individuality in a historical process. And it's that struggle with my individuality in a historical process, which I think is what's constant by the type of non-relation that I think is being pointed towards in like you said, analytic hieroglyph, which I think is a nice way to say it. And then I approach it from a different way. I could approach it from intimate space, a sexual space, which I think is where it's originally being developed and formulated, namely that men and women, or not just men and women, but let's say sexual energy in intimate relationships between humans. It could be a sexual relationship. It could be in a parental family unit. It could be in a community space. I basically think that this has a general applicability to what I would call intimate geometry in general. That the relationships within this are constituted by a certain non-relationship, a certain non-unity, which needs to be there's no general rules that can be put on the space to solve the space. It kind of requires an ongoing negotiation. It requires an ongoing awareness. And then I think the non-relationship, where it's sort of was originally conceptually formulated, was as it relates to intimate spaces. Of course, we have to think about the first relationship where this is being constituted is in an analytic session. And look, all the analytic ideas are really coming from the speech in an analytic session. And then, as you can sort of abstract or generalize that, and however that's useful outside of the analytic clinic, I think there is utility to these concepts outside of an analytic clinic. And I would say the idea of the non-relationship can be used to describe the way in which intimate relationships, the conditions of certain intimate relationships, are governed by a certain non-relationship, whether that's a sexual relationship, whether that's a dynamic with mothers and fathers and children, or community dynamics. I think this concept's also useful, and I think it basically has a relationship to possibly the way in the one appears in these intimate relationships. Of course, when we say, I love you, you're the one for me, I want to be with you forever, or until death, these types of notions in the most intimate context is the way in which the one sort of appears. And then you can think, for example, of course, you have breakups, you have divorces, you have friendships, they form and they unform. You have different social groups where, the very nature of the social group is constantly being constituted by its breaking apart. It's, it's that relationships within it come and go and they change. And so the non-relationship is an important concept, I think, because it doesn't just emphasize the positivity of phenomena, namely that there's just constant change. And like we live in a fleeting reality of appearances that come and go, and the only constant is change. But also that change is being constituted by a certain negativity, a certain absence, which has a real effect. It has a real structuring effect. Like, it's not enough to say in an intimate context that things just change and things just, come and go and change over time. It's like there's still this desire, which I think is, in my view, and the way I gravitate to this philosophy, is I think it's indeconstructible. There's a certain indeconstructibility about it. So those are like, and that I apply that in like my actual personal life, like my actual personal life has this concept has informed my libidinal, my sexual, my romantic development, and making sense of things, like, and making sense of how to engage the ethics of this space, and learn about both myself, learn more about myself, first and foremost, and of course about the other. I would say, for example, in the first half of my young adult life, I was in a mode of wanting the one, and that was dominant. That was a dominant psychic structure in my mind. And then I went into a phase of, okay, I'm going to deconstruct the one, and there's just going to be sort of a multiplicity. I think all this in philosophy, one, multiplicity, these are fundamental philosophical concepts. And now in my 30s, more and more, I'm coming to, I think, an understanding of polarity, which has an ability quality, meaning it's, there's a one in there, and this one another just depends on it's just like this, navigating this. There's a type of abyssal nature. There's a type of not oneness. There's what this means practically. And I've had conversations about this, is it's like the intimate relationship, not to fuse into one, but the intimate relationship to guard each other's aloneness. That's where I am.
Well, there's a lot of stuff there. First, at the most banal level, it definitely popped into my head that if Lacan's looking at the discourse that arises in the therapeutic context, then of course nobody's presencing sex unless it's not working. But that can lead him to all kinds of very general conclusions about the nature of the experience of being in the world, which is very intriguing. Your story about the interplay between let's say the manifest realm of eternal dissatisfaction as compared to this other satisfaction, which is missing from all possible satisfactions. That's very intriguing. And it makes me think about, in my own approach, spiritual practice as a way of continually blurring that line, of causing the realm of insufficiency to constantly more and more resemble the sufficiency mode, through a variety of different, even like micro-cognitive processes that you can apply in particular circumstances, sit down and do a practice kind of thing. But part of that is, and a kind of a Zizekian move, right, to reapply that realm of dissatisfaction back into the desireless, satisfying one, whatever that experience was. And I wonder how you think about that. How do you think about the desireless satisfaction state as being itself some implicit version of the unsatisfied state?
I think the general, so when you say it's a Zizekian move, like maybe I'll unpack what you mean by that, or how I would relate to that. It's like, let me juxtapose it with another great thinker, Stan Grof, who I think I brought him up in our previous conversation. But what I see in a lot of Grof's work, and it's reflected, I think, in a lot of spiritual practice, is the sort of giving a sort of ontological primacy to the transcendental state that you experience in psychedelics. Like basically the logic is so if I do 5-MeO DMT, what I experience on 5-MeO DMT is more real than reality, that there's a true reality, a true unified reality. I think most people, what they say when they say a non-dual state of consciousness, I think that's what is being pointed towards. And I have touch with that, and I experience with that. And I also have an emotional relationship to that experience as has a reality valence. There's something more real, like there is that feeling that comes with that experience. What I take as the Zizekian move is kind of like, it's the opposite of that move, which is almost in some sense, and these are not like mutually exclusive categories, but the opposite of the move is kind of saying, okay, we can have the non-dual state of consciousness, but that doesn't necessarily solve my intimate problems, or it doesn't necessarily solve my socioeconomic problems. Like so like, for example, like 2 years ago, I had the experience of the 5-MeO DMT, and then I come back to this reality, and well, I still have huge ethical problems in sexual space. I still have huge socioeconomic, socio-political problems. Now I'm informed by a certain higher reality, or whatever we want to call it, but it's also leaving me in this individual historical reality with a heightened intensity, a heightened sensitivity, which in many ways is making my life more problematic. You know, like because I have a heightened sensitivity, and because I have a heightened intensity and sensitivity, and it doesn't solve the problem that others or myself have this desire for a type of unity, or a type of once, or a type of purity and stability with the other. You know, so this move is basically how I try to think about it, is you can have a spiritual practice, and I like the way you were describing spiritual practice and so forth. You could have a contact with a, whatever we want to call it, higher reality, or some deep principle of unity, but the problem of thinking both my personal, individual, and social tensions with the other and social space are, it's very open, it's still very incomplete, and we still have attachment issues, and still have implicit and unconscious dynamics which are governing the space. I think that's what's crucial, is in my experience with this thinking this other space, is that there's a lot of what is being governed in that space is implicit, unconscious. It's not so clear how to approach space. It's not so clear if, for example, making what's implicit and unconscious explicit and conscious solves the problems of that space. Also, I also run into I like in the work of Alenka Zupancic, she describes that space as inherently disorienting. So you have her idea of object disoriented ontology, which is kind of a joke about object oriented ontology. But the idea of object disoriented ontology is how I relate to it, is like when it comes to like the distinction between truth and fiction, like the lines are very difficult it's very difficult to know what is true and what is fictional, or the truth that is fictional. And I want to make a distinction with that idea and the idea of what I often hear in a lot of spiritual spaces, which is a distinction between my ego self, which is fictional, and the true, deeper, underlying unified self. You know, that's a common distinction, right? That's made. You have the fictional ego, and you have the true self, which is a unified self, which we all share. I think that when you make this Zizekian move, you're presented with an opposite problem, which is not this distinction between the fictional ego and the true unified self, which we all share, but rather a truth which is mediated by fiction. And so, like, for example, you run into like very practical, emotionally difficult problems. Like, for example, a few years ago when my nan was still alive, we would have endless conversations into the night about heaven and the afterlife. And she was a Mormon, practicing Mormon. Now, what is the ethical move on my part? Is it to engage in a type of Richard Dawkins mode of critique, saying, you know, like, this other life, this afterlife, this fictional reality that you have is just nonsense, it has no empirical validity, and so forth? Or do I see the fiction of her worldview as actually something very important that helps her to deal with old age? And who am I to take that away from her? right? Like, so there's a little bit of a nuance here with fiction and truth. Well, like, what am I looking for? What is the truth? Is the truth that her fiction is actually helping her be my nan? Like, because that truth might help her actually be my grandmother. And she did amazing things. She would, like the fact that she would host me in the evening and make me a nice dinner and tea, and we could have nice conversations, and her house was nice, and she was very pleasant, and she was very friendly. Well, maybe all that's possible on the condition that she has that fiction. Maybe without that fiction, she wouldn't have the capacity to do that.
Oh, there's so much rich stuff here. So I'm thinking of the distinction that I make between causal and non-dual mysticism. And in causal mysticism, there's sort of this affirmation of a nothingness or a oneness or some alternative kind of homogeneous transcendental condition. And in non-duality, although people don't always use the words these ways, in non-duality, as opposed to saying oneness, you're saying not two-ness. What you're doing is canceling but somewhat preserving an opposition rather than asserting a unity. So that to me is a way of doing that Zizekian move. So the Zizekian move of like Job talking to God and humans thinking God's a mystery and God saying, yes, I'm a mystery, or we don't know what God's up to and God doesn't know what God's up to, or rather than doing the thing you were talking about, saying the ego's a fiction and this other dimension is the truth, we can say, well, if that other dimension is also a fiction, if I inscribe that back into that thing, then somehow I'm in a better position to move forward with it somehow. So if we take the difference between the world of differences and the world of non-difference, and I inscribe that back into the world of non-difference, then what that thing is, what the non-duality is the non-difference between difference and non-difference. And then that opens up a different set of possibilities from merely experiencing a unitive condition. It opens up the possibility of seeing the dynamic that's at work in my optimal problem-solving modes. So it doesn't solve all my problems, but it offers me an insight into the particular relational balances and flow states in which I might have my best chance at solving my problems relationally, if I can continue to find that in all of the different dimensions of my life. So that's a way of thinking non-dual spirit coming into the world in a way that's somehow composite to these kinds of insights.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the formula that you proposed here of the non-difference between difference and non-difference.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that axiom is actually present to the almost identical formulation in the opening chapter of Zizek's Less Than Nothing. So it's basically working with the similar principle. I think in the way it's formulated in Less Than Nothing is the non-division between division and non-division. But that's the same way you're saying, but with non-difference and difference and non-difference. But it's a difficult idea to wrap your head around. But if you are able to think it, I do think that it has the type of beneficial effect that you were describing there. With it's kind of basically, yeah, if I was to relate to what you were saying in my own way, it definitely doesn't solve all your problems. The problems I have now versus the problems I had before, for example, experiences of this different state of consciousness, are in many ways or analogous. But my reactivity to them, my capacity to hold them is much, much different. And then the subtle change in my capacity, my reactivity and my holding does have a real effect and consequence on others and on unfolding of my individual historical identity. So the best example I would give is like one that I was almost hinting towards last time, where I think if I didn't have contact with that other space, I think my present reality will be much more concerned with, for example, what I perceive now to be kind of superficial distinctions in a professional development sense. My identity, my identity would almost feel the need to be recognized for a certain professional distinction. And if I didn't get that professional distinction, I would be hurt, or I would feel unactualized, or I would feel less than. And that's the same in the sexual space as well. I feel like my identity hang a lot more on recognition of my intimate partner than it does now. And that doesn't mean that I don't still strive for excellence in my work or in my intimate relationships. But there's a deep difference in the way I'm experiencing these things.
Yeah. I mean, the work I do on the metaphysics of adjacency tends to think of the context of proximity, right, as a gradient set of options whereby you can optimize proximity better. And proximity or adjacency itself is a kind of functionalist way of thinking the non-difference between difference and non-difference, right? When you are near something, you're not the same as that thing and you're not different than that thing, right? That distinction has blurred in nearness. So when one lover says to the other lover, now, I want to be one with you, they don't really mean they want to be one with you. They mean they want to be a lot closer, right? And so taking off the pressure of that absolute distinction between being separated and being unified allows this room to move. And in that room to move, which is inherently a non-dual capacity, you have the ability to find the better proximity in any given circumstance. But actually, I want to pivot from that a little bit because you were talking about truth and fiction. And I think there's a way to get back to our ostensible topic here, which is thinking about whether, coming at this from a slightly different angle, is evolutionary progress fantasy or reality, right? And so I think that question surfaces the problem in a different way, which is, you've written about this, the relationship between the human narrative observer and the big history story of the unfolding, regime of self-organizing complexities. What does the imperfection of the sexual relation tell us about how to more responsibly conceive the place of how the evolutionary theorist is related to the evolving universe?
Yeah. So yeah, that's also a nice framing in relationship to what I've written about in my thesis. I think this is a really deep question, and I'm just trying to think how I should best approach or respond to it, because it really does go to the core of a deep metaphysical issue that it kind of has to do with like the idea of the objective past. I think there's a way in which, because Darwinian metaphysics is conceived of as in a lineage with the classical Newtonian scientific picture of the world, what comes with a lot of Darwinian thinking is this idea of objective externality, an objective external world which exists independently of us and narratives and our framings of that world. The relationship, therefore, between the evolutionary theorist and that objective external world is problematized. How I would frame it is kind of, in my current way of thinking, is thinking about the past as a virtual construct. And that the past as a virtual construct is organized by consciousness in the present, and that's an objective fact. So it's an objective fact that consciousness in the present capacity to organize a set of facts or organize a narrative on what happened in the past, and that organization, that narrative in the past, has a meaning for the telos or the valence of the present. Now that idea is an idea that is derived from Freud's observations of the analytic session, which is that when a subject is dealing with their intimate past, what matters about intimate past is often not the objective external happening, but what matters is the present moment of that self-consciousness's organization of the past. And that has an affect dimension, meaning it has an impact on how the subject is moving into the future. So I would say that observation has consequences for the evolution when it comes thinking about future of this human society. So how we organize our narrative about the past has a meaningful impact and should be primarily thought of as how humans at present are thinking their move to the future, which is a different way of thinking. It's a different way of thinking than, and so like, and I'm saying that in the context of someone who was trained as an academic in an evolutionary way of thinking. I was trained in the Darwinian way of thinking. So I know how I was thinking in that big history picture. Now, let me give a one concrete example of how I think this doesn't only have sort of human socio-political consequences, but also scientific consequences in the classical sense. So, for example, in the present moment, we have a narrative about the cosmos, which is organized around the origin of the Big Bang. Now, we discovered the Big Bang in the 1950s or the 1960s. But that doesn't mean that the Big Bang came into existence when we discovered it. It presumably happened. There's some independent reality to it. But it does mean that as it relates to our socio-historical conception of the universe we live in, we were totally unaware of that fact. And it had no inclusion into a narrative we were telling ourselves in a socio-historical process. In fact, that there were many scientists who believed before the discovery of the Big Bang that the universe was eternal. Now, what I'm saying, this has huge socio-historical consequences to think in this other way about the narrative of the past, is that what if we discover something in 50 years in the future, which changes our conception of the cosmos just as much as discovering the Big Bang changed our conception of the cosmos? That means that there's something that's objectively true that we have no idea about, that we're socio-historically oblivious to, which will have a meaningful effect on how socio-historical organization manifests a future. And that's very practical because there's billions upon billions upon billions of dollars being put into something like CERN. And I don't think CERN would be doing what they were doing, which is trying to recreate the early conditions of the universe, if we had never discovered the Big Bang in the first place.
So there's room to move. There's room to change our views, precisely because there's some constitutive gap between our understanding of the system and what the system actually is. And then there's the question, on the one hand, there's the question of allowing that, accepting that, kind of scoping that out in different areas of the world. And then there's the idea of, well, how do we work with that? How do we compensate for that, right? So I'm thinking now of Lacan's notion of l'objet petit a, and things like to enjoy sex, which is obviously easier if you have freely working physiology, a la Wilhelm Reich, but it also requires a justification system, a semantic supplement of some kind. Something has to help us enjoy, right? We need apparently an operational particularity of desire, a target, a validation, a prompt, some way to organize ourselves so that we can enter into a mode of arousal and rapport and intimacy. To get turned on, we need something to help us do that. So we organize ourselves around an idea. And then there's the critique, right, which is a little bit of a Lacanian critique, that when we're relating to the other, we're not actually relating to the other so much as we're relating to whatever semantic detail we use to get ourselves into that mode. And so when we apply that to the notion of evolutionary history, it seems like we might need some details, some fiction in order to activate the mode of our deeper participation in evolving, unfolding, complexifying, inhabiting the world better, things like that. So we have these notions of the transformative power of Kundalini, or we have these notions of an inherent evolutionary eros. How do you think about the utility, right, of these ideas as sort of triggers for a mode of evolution in ourselves, as like a constitutive lie we might tell ourselves about, oh, the world just is fundamentally evolving toward the telos, right? And I never can know if that's true, but I might be able, through telling myself that that's true, to go into a mode where I perform better in terms of my own evolutionary unfolding. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think So let me try and relate to this with a concept that Lacan proposed called traversing the fantasy. Now, the name traversing the fantasy is Lacan's name for the end of analysis. It's kind of maybe could be named better because it's slightly misleading, because traversing the fantasy does not mean the end of fantasy, but kind of a different relationship to fantasy. What is that different relationship to fantasy? That's, I think, what's key to understanding as it relates to why Lacan named it that. I think it has a lot to do with overcoming the Oedipal drama governing sexuality. So the unconscious sexuality is basically means that before the end of analysis, your motivation system, your libidinal drive, is being governed by trying to reclaim an intimacy from the past. After analysis, there's a more open, meaning that your libidinal drive is not much being governed by trying to reclaim this unconscious intimacy that you had in childhood. And that means you can have a sort of different relationship to sexuality, and you have a different relationship to social life, and you can have a different relationship to how you dream and why your dreams are being moved the way they are. I almost want to think about here that it would be very interesting to have a conference which brought together psychoanalysts and people in various kink communities, because people in various kink communities actually have a very interesting expression of their libido, and they work through their libido in a very non-normative way, but also in a way that has rules and constraints. And has norms emerge from the kink communities, and what's okay and what's not okay in certain contexts, and who's performing in this weird way. These weird communities emerge. Now, these weird communities might be something like what Lacan is saying as meaning that they have a totally different relationship to fantasy than the one that's being governed by the Oedipal conditions of, let's say, normative historical society. So, but what that means ultimately is that it's not simply that we overcome fiction for the truth. It's that there's an unconscious truth which is mediating our fiction in the Oedipal condition. And that unconscious truth is kind of the context of your birth and the family unit, or the intimate relationships that were holding you when you were a child. And then after the Oedipal condition, it's kind of like, it's almost like the relationship between fiction and truth is different, because the unconscious truth has been made conscious. And that doesn't mean that there's no more truth, but it means that the way in which you can organize that truth is wider. It's more expansive. It's not totally unconstrained, but there's larger conditions of possibility. There's more opening. There's more freedom.
That makes me think of Tantra, and I think Tantra and kink have a certain kind of complementarity as being different ways of exploring sexuality through non-standard intensities and with greater intentionality. And one of the common features of certain kinds of, this is like, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel tantrique. Like, is there tantric sexual relation? Because one of the things they do, which seems like it would fit within this broader range of possibilities afforded by the therapeutic transformation of fantasy and desire, is this practice of trying to sexually relate to the other as deity. Right? So you're allowing the other to be the maximal possible other in a reciprocal relationship. Now, you're doing it intentionally, but it seems I would be curious on your take about that, coming from like an analytic point of view. because there's a certain supposition in some tantric communities that you can actually accomplish that, right? That by experiencing the other not as the mortal human limited other, but as the absolutely unlimited other, that they're going to make contact, satisfying, perfect contact with this absolute reciprocal other. And that seems a little bit problematic, but you could also do it in the sense of having gone through the therapeutic work already, traverse the fantasy, and understanding that as just one of the interesting options that are now available to you in your more unbound relationship to the fantasy and desire structures.
My experience and exposure to tantric sexuality, like my first contact with it intellectually, is that there's a lot of overlap and actually synergy between the tantric way of viewing things and what's being pointed to in the idea of the end of analysis. And of course, both are dealing with sexuality. It'd be interesting to know how they differ. But the first principle of Tantra, as I've been taught it, in my view, seems to mobilize the non-relationship as its key power. Meaning that, for example, what men are taught is that you have to withhold ejaculation. For example, like it's basically for the men, you be trained to be in relationship to your body energy in such a way as that you're not conditioning your body to constantly release your sexual energy. You're trained to be with your sexual energy, to keep it within your body. And still, that doesn't mean to be abstinent and not have sexual relationships, but you have to have sexual relationships while keeping this energy moving in your body at a certain intensity. So that, to me, and the way people, when I talk to people who are very knowledgeable in terms of tantric practice, what they basically say is what that opens up is a more playful space with the other, where the sexual act is something which moves differently. It has a different goal structure. In a similar way that I was describing how Celix changed my goal structure in relationship to my professional space, it seemed like the tantric sexuality has the aim of changing the goal structure as it relates to the normative way people approach sexuality. And that involves having a knowledge of your libidinal energy at its highest intensity and being comfortable with it and moving through your body differently. And then the identities or the fictions we play with in that space become different than and more. Again, I think the idea of not unconstrained is a higher level of constraint. It's not anything goes. There's more possibility for exploration than there was before, in a way that might be useful for young in particular to, if they're listening to this. It's kind of like, if you're very untrained with your sexual energy and you're being trained by pornography and you're just masturbating and releasing your sexual energy very quickly, you might be very used to the idea of sexual relationship in itself is something that lasts maybe 10 minutes and ends in ejaculation. But the tantric and that it's being, practiced in a very constrained space with very constrained identities. The tantric space moves that energy and opens it up to new types of identities. It's like a qualitative transformation. That's how I would relate to this, where these intersections are made, and it's specifically the practical use of the non-relation. Because what that means is that Lacan's saying that he's had the algorithm, the barred subject and the object patia is like his fundamental algorithm. And what that means is basically that your most fundamental fantasy is being concentrated in a partial object which you can't get. You're barred from it. So Tantra is saying that non-relationship is power to the higher qualitative expression of sexuality. That's how I would make sense of Tantra mobilization of the algorithm.
Interesting. I'm thinking of the way this complexifies the relationship of desire and non-desire, which fits back into what we were saying at the beginning, right? Because one of the ways I think about Tantra, and your examples were great on this, is a progressive deepening of understanding of the fact that desire is the site at which the non-desiring is instantiated, right? So if we think about desire, I have desire, I want to get rid of desire, I want to get to the non-desiring state as quickly as possible, then those are my opposites. But if I mix them together, if I sort of inscribe them into each other, then I have a situation in which satisfaction or non-desire is actually itself some kind of endlessly unfolding desiring process. And desire is an experience in which non-desiring can appear if I can inhabit that better, which I have to do by allowing myself, taking advantage of whatever practices allow me to slow down, prevent climax, or just be more sensorily and consciousness bodily present to inhabit that. To make a container in which I can not be overwhelmed by desire, but can actually be with desire more. And the more I'm with desire, the more satisfying desire itself seems to be. And there's a strong connection there with Sufi mysticism, where what we call not devotional non-duality exists, where I'm constantly a yearning surrender to the other one of the divine, who I yearn for and surrender precisely because it's not different than me. So there's an interesting folding in of the seeming insufficiency mode, which can deepen into something like a sufficiency mode, although it never perfectly attains that. But you can get better and better at desire as satisfaction, which seems to also provide an increased awareness of the richness of the world and an increased liveliness through the organism.
Yeah, I think my most intimate sort of experience of this and working with this, well, and like before, maybe I described my personal relationship to it. I would say that this manifests a very broad scale social, cultural patterns, which I think are ubiquitous, which is on the one hand, you have, I think, the pornography culture, which is basically governs a lot of traffic on the internet, and I think it governs a lot of individual men's lives and women too, but I think men probably almost universally struggle with this. And then on the other hand, you have the fast food culture, you have the junk food culture, you have the way we eat. These are very primal, deeply ingrained modes in which we desire. And I like talking about these two modes because I think everyone will be able to relate to these experiences and desires and cravings on some level, just the basic, and this reflects actually something I like that Schopenhauer said about the mystery of life. He thought it was so strange that life could be so complex and at the same time governed by such simple motive drives as eating and sexuality, like, so these two, he actually calls them these two twin, simple processes. In any case, when I relate on these processes within myself, what I'm trying to do inside myself is become more aware of the fact that how strange is it that this sexual energy is moving inside of me, and yet the unconscious way I relate to it is to get rid of it. Isn't that, like, I start like questioning myself like in a very deep way? Why is it that I try to get rid of it very quickly as opposed to being with it and find what is missing in my own mode of engagement with my own body that I need to mature, that I need to develop, that I need to become more conscious about my own unconscious substance? It's very very practical, very, very simple. And the same thing with eating is that sometimes, like, I find like that the way I enjoy my favorite foods is actually itself very unconsciously mediated, that I'm actually trying to do it very quickly, trying to get it over with very quickly, almost like in a sense, when I think about it, it's kind of like, am I trying to get this over with very quickly? So what that means very practically for my own path is it's part of this general principle that I've been trying to work with, which is that you have to slow down for the truth to catch up. So this slowing down for the truth to catch up, I would just relate to as a simple principle that can be applied to these very simple drives as relate to sexuality and eating, is that the truth of your substance, you need to become more conscious of it, and that's why you're slowing down. And then there might be a tipping point where you could actually move with the truth of your substance in a new way.
I've lived in a lot of tourist towns, and one of the things you see is busloads of people show up from some other part of the world, and they have pieces of paper which tell them where there's something they're supposed to see. They go to that place and they take a picture of themselves right next to that thing, and then they go home and they show the picture. All right, and you're like, in what sense is this a vacation? It seems to me they're still at work. So your story of kind of treating desire as a chore to get done with is interesting, right? And it fits in with these Lacanian ideas. So if to some degree society is telling us how to mediate our desiring, then we're in service to something social when we think we're doing something relative to personal desire. And the idea that these might build up in layers of increasing complexity or just different styles adapted to different modes of production or whatever is fascinating, because I think there are a lot of people who agree about the problem, right? Like, get the burger, get the ejaculation, get the degree, get the car, whatever it is. They go, that's a problem. But instead of adapting to it as a form of energy that could transform them by allowing them to know themselves and the world more deeply through partly slowing down, they decide there's a better way to accomplish that, which is through the neutralization of the problems, right? So instead of trying to neutralize the differential of desire by getting the hamburger, I now wish to neutralize it in a bold new social step forward by neutralizing the difference between men and women, the difference between races, the difference between classes. I want everyone to meet everyone else as an absolutely equal subject. But it seems like the Lacanian formulation says that never can actually occur. You're never going to get away from some kind of discrepancy. And what you're doing in trying to equalize the relation of all the subjects is really a more sophisticated version of the same thing, where you're trying to just get the burger to make the desire go away. You're trying to undo the differential.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think the way in which these mechanisms have an influence on politics is fundamental, and that's broadly what I mean when I say libidinal economy or the libidinal economic view on politics. Is that when you're analyzing the desire as it relates to food and sex drives, this actually does have an impact on the way we view each other and the world and how we organize politically. They're not disconnected in some sense. There's a more of a continuity between these two dimensions of our existence. And I mean, I would hypothesize that if you had a society of people that were trained to be with their sexual energy and their primal energy in a more sophisticated way, and the adults were trained with it in a different way, and that was somehow embedded in a different type of educational system, that this would have a major impact on how we think about sexual difference, racial difference, and class difference. So it would have a huge impact on politics.
Another area
like what is underlying, but they go on, but I'm just saying what is the question is, what is underlying the antagonism of, why do we want to get rid of it? Why do we see it as so problematic instead of something to work with?
Yeah. Is it a feature or a bug?
Yeah. We see a bug, but actually it's kind of like the thing we started our conversations with, where it was like, enjoy your symptom. It's kind of like the symptom, the thing you think is a problem is actually something that is a source of enjoyment. And so it's the same thing, like the thing you think is a bug, the thing you want to get rid of is actually something, the feature of the system that's a huge source of potentially rising power and energy.
Another way to come at this is through the left-right brain metaphor, right? Because we often think of those in kind of sexualized or gendered terms. People like Ian McGilchrist and others before him are pointing to a neuroanthropological imbalance holding sway since the Enlightenment, right? That needs to diagnose itself and place the reasoning targeting faculty back in the service of a dominant subconscious of flows and contexts. And it's conceived as either a primal return or as a social improvement of some kind. Right. But then the question is, what is the better negotiated relationship between these hemispheres? Right. We don't want to just switch from one to the other. Maybe the way we're talking, we don't want to neutralize the difference between them and have them just be in some kind of idealized perfect balance. The way that McGilchrist and maybe people like Alan Watts and Heidegger approach it is to use the left brain to sort of precisely articulate the way it thinks the right brain sees things. That's a new way of negotiating it. I tend to worry about that a little bit because I think it undervalues the role that the left brain could have in challenging the right brain, right? It's not just surrender to the goddess. You also have to help the goddess by challenging the goddess. So, where is it appropriate for the left brain to oppose the right brain? How do we think about these two modes in terms of the inherent differential within the sexual relation? Does it tell us anything about that?
I think it's like, it's similar. I like actually quite a lot the way I want to preface what I'm going to say with I understand the way you're talking about McGilchrist's hypothesis, the left and the right brain, as actually something quite new that you're saying. I think it's quite original what you're saying about McGilchrist. So, in the context of what you're saying in that left and right brain metaphor, is that I think it has a mirror parallel with what we were talking about as it relates to the mystical state and the kind of complex dialectics of the non-relation, which is, I would see the mystical state as the goddess, and I would see the challenging of the goddess being something similar to what I was thinking in the example of, okay, I have the 5-MeO DMT experience, but then I go back to my reality and actually I'm still struggling with my practical social relationships. Meaning that just because I have contact with the goddess, that doesn't mean I can just have that image as a protection against all of the practical things that are going wrong in my day-to-day life. So what it brings us to in a Lacanian terminology is the idea that there is no woman. So there is no woman here is in the context of challenging the goddess. So when you say challenge the goddess, what Lacan would say is that is an and so this would be, I guess, a psychoanalytic interpretation of the mystical state or the psychedelic state, which is that you are being brought back to a state of unity that might be a memory from or it might be a memory from the time before division, or the time before separation, or the time before a gap. And my interpretation, when I hear people sort of identifying with the right hemisphere or identifying with the mystical state, is the idea that, one, they're shutting down their own thinking processes. Two, they might not actually want to be alive. And three, they're not willing to think problematics of their own identity. So I'll maybe repeat or summarize that as, on the one hand, the shutting down of thinking processes. On the other hand, might be a death drive. And three, the inability to really play like with the problematic nature of your historical identity. And I think that does appear in, like, you hear stories, for example, like I've heard actually from more people than I would like to say I've heard from, is that they've had experiences with psychedelic healers or shamans or whatever, where there is inappropriate sexual behavior, for example. So just to say, like, just because you have regular contact with these non-dual states, that doesn't mean that all of your sexual desire just disappears and there's no more here thinking or living that requires deep thought. I don't know if this meaningfully relates to what you were talking about with the left and the right brain, but this is sort of how I'm trying to think about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The non-existence of the woman is an interesting part of that Lacanian formulation that a lot of people have difficulty getting into and appreciating. I think there's a way to tease that apart, where if we talk about a female as the protagonist, then she also doesn't have the feminine other relative to herself.
Yes, exactly.
Now then, thinking about what these things are, like the masculine and the feminine in this mode of thinking, is really intriguing. I don't know if I said last time my strip club metaphor, which is one of the first ways I ever started thinking about it. Yeah. where like the male gaze is also the gaze of the people who sold the clothes to the woman and built the stage. And then she comes out and removes them and then leaves. They don't want to see her naked. They want to see her removing the packaging. They're packaging enabling. She's packaging eluding. So that was one of the first ways I started to think about it. But I know I've heard some very other interesting, intricate formulations. I've heard it said that there's that like the yang is totalization, but with an exception, and yin is non-totalization, but with no exceptions. Right? There's one rule where at least one thing escapes the rule, and only exceptions, but nothing escapes the regime of only exceptions. Or the idea is, the Platonic version, the idea is related to all the imperfect examples, or the yin version of that, there are only examples and they're more real than the idea. So these are some very sophisticated ways to language what these two players are that lack a complete relationship. How do you think about what they are? Male, female, yin, yang, whatever you think those two poles are, how do you language them to yourself?
Okay, so I do have sort of a relationship with the examples you were giving about totalization and exception. Is the masculine, like, so this is unconscious. I'm going to try and talk about unconscious sexuality. How I understand it is that unconscious masculinity is a type of totalization without exception, meaning that they want a general rule, a general principle where nothing escapes. Like all of the particulars are covered by the totalization. There's actually, this is very practical when it comes to some conflicts that are emerging in the European men's movement that I'm roughly associated with. There is this tendency in man to want a frame in which nothing escapes his gaze, his dominion, nothing escapes his domination. And then the unconscious female sexuality is that there's no totalization and there are only exceptions, there are only particulars. Now, how I've heard this described in the Lacanian tradition is that this is a philosophical battle between the Platonic and the sophistry. Sophistry is that there's no truth, there's no total truth, there's just particulars. And the Platonic view is that there's just the one with no exception, that all of the particulars are a reflection of the one. How the Lacanians I've read deal with this is that there is a dialectic between these two unconscious modes of sexuality, which produces a weird third where they're don't know how to describe it in a formula, but there's a different relationship between totalization and exception, which don't fall into these two unconscious modes. And I would say that these two unconscious modes do have a sort of a philosophical historicity, that there are certain moments of philosophy where one mode predominates over the other. I would say the modernist metaphysics is often criticized for being totalizing without exception. It's seen as masculine. However, the postmodern is often seen as feminine, meaning that there's no totalization, but there's only exceptions. And that we have to go into all of the exceptions. So, like, for example, this appears very practically in post-colonial theory, where in order to understand India, you have to be Indian. Right? In order to understand Nigeria, you have to be Nigerian. There's no total, there's no totalizing shared humanity within which we understand what it means to be human. There are only particulars. The experience of being Nigerian, the experience of being Indian, the experience of being European, and there's nothing that brings into a higher order understanding. So this is a very practical way in which these two modes of thinking, totalization and exception, manifest themselves. It has a huge consequence on social dynamics.
Yeah, I think, well, for me, the non-dual frame around that is the notion of the many one, right? That you can't fundamentally separate singularity and plurality, which I think has a role to play in how we conceive social politics, but also in how we conceive things like the unitive state doesn't solve all of your problems in your different areas of life, which is to say the that's true if we're thinking of the one and the many as distinct, but it starts to become a platform for growing towards solutions when the one and the many are understood to be somehow impossible to separate. There's another element to that. I mean, the notion of exceptions is interesting because you might say that the male mode wants to totalize everything, but there's also this notion that it always presupposes an obscene supplement, right? Where at least somebody escapes. So if I get to have a totalizing view of all humanity rather than just all the different individual parts, it almost always turns out to be the case that I'm also proposing that somebody gets to behave inhumanly in that scenario where I've specified our shared humanity, right? So how do we think about the system of order as a proposed totality, which always has some kind of obscene supplement that guarantees that it functions as an ideology?
That's amazing. Yeah, so let's talk about that. So this notion that the male gaze does want to totalize, but that there's always an obscene supplement to this totalization. So like let's I think I could analyze, I could give an example of how I relate to this notion as it relates to our recent history. Is that I do think it's a fair critique to say that the European mind in the age of colonial expansion, I'm thinking here, let's say 18th to 20th century, or 17th to 20th century, that there was a dimension, the patriarchy or masculine drive wanted to totalize and come up with a view of the human, and even develop the idea of humanism, that we're all one species, that we're all, the human race under the gaze of the European, right? And I think the consequence of all of our global institutions are kind of a result of that. Like when you can think about the UN, but you think about what was happening before the UN was the League of Nations, it was progressively coming from the Western European. Now, there was always an obscene supplement to that totalization, always. So the obscene supplement in the United States was slavery. You'd have the slave trade, where African Americans were systematically related to in an obscene way, right? Like there were lynchings and hangings, we don't go into, but like they were treated as an inhuman other. So there's even debates about the humanity, right? So within, like it's and like you can see this even in like the founding documents of the American state. Like the founding documents of the American state have this totalizing view of freedom and human rights and dignity and so forth. But within that context, there's an obscene supplement. So I do think that real radicality, let's say libidinal economy, is to use the obscene supplement to break the false totalization and creates a new totality. Like so, it's always that what cannot be included into the false totality is also to the new totality.
And is that occurring kind of fractally at all scales, where you go, well, we're all human beings. You go, well, we're not human beings, we're Americans. And they go, well, we're not Americans, we're Native Americans, right? Or whatever. Like when you assert what seems like an exceptional non-plural identity in a world of exceptional plural identities that escape the unifying gaze, aren't you also almost always in that moment asserting another smaller totalizing gaze in which that same process is going to occur again? As right, we get splintered groups of every exceptional group.
Yeah, like I'm not searching for, okay, it's hard to say. I'm not trying to articulate that there's an end to that process. I think that there's probably a way in which every totality has to be supplemented by a type of obscene excess. And I guess if you're to break this down fractally, the truth is in the obscene excess.
Right.
And the relationship between fiction and truth is in the obscene excess. The totalizing frame might constrain the space or hold the space for a temporal moment, but it's not going to hold eternally. Another way to think about this is the relationship between the bar subject and the object patia. That the object patia is the obscene excess, and the barred subject is the false totalization. That could be a way to think about it.
What do we learn about a situation when we find its specific obscene excess? Like, what if I was like, I had a group of people and we identify as a subculture? We're not part of the totalizing hegemony of the main culture. We're all like this, but we maintain that by really picking on one guy in our group. Right? So, like, if you're an analyst, if you figure out who's catching the shit, so to speak, what does that tell us? What do we learn by identifying a particular example of an obscene supplement in a given circumstance?
Oh man, it's a deep question, man. It's a deep question. I almost I almost don't know how to answer it, but like it's kind of like it's like what I want to say before I maybe give some examples is that when we talk about development or when we talk about maturation, I would want to say that the real of the development or the real of the maturation has to do with the obscene excess, how we relate to the obscene excess. So like, for example, when I was in middle school, I was actually not very popular. There was a brief window of my school experience where I was picked on quite hard. Had a big impact on my development, by the way. But in that time, I was a part of a group of guys where there was me and another guy who were kind of systematically used as a punching bag. And I started to notice that the very existence of us as punching bags constituted their friendship as a totality. Meaning that if we weren't there to be the punching bags, they just existing as a totality within themselves, they couldn't be a totality in themselves. Right? So their friendship, they would have to find a new punching bag in order to keep their totality together, meaning they weren't really, the thing with unity is that it's never a unity which is self-sustaining. That's I think the deepest point. So once you realize that the unity is not self-sustaining and that there has to be some obscene excess, then the question is, well, what is my relationship with that obscene excess as such? And can I mirror that? Can I relate to that in a more enlightened way? I think I'm literally just freestyling. I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head and how it might relate perhaps to what we were talking about with the tantric space. So for example, it could be that a lot of the ways in which like sort of the blanket humanism or the blanket Eurocentrism that produces obscene excesses, not just in the African American example, but also in the Native American example, and also in the general othering of people, like for example, Edward Said's Orientalism comes to mind. That was a particularly striking book. Not necessarily if I agree 100% with the thesis, but the idea that the very idea of the Orient or the very idea of Asia or the very idea of India comes out of kind of a European context. Like they don't like, and that was very obvious to me when I was in Cameroon, for example. It was very obvious that the idea of Cameroon was more European than an African reality. So my point being that in challenging this pseudo-totality, it's not that we're going to get rid of totality, but it's that totality as such is going to be reinvented from different obscene excesses, which are local. To give a very practical example, like in the Cameroonian context, I was in very many different areas of Cameroon, from the most wealthy areas to the most tribal or rural areas. And there was no shortage of obscene excess between different groups. Right? Like we were actually on the border of some territories in some villages where, like, you know, there's guys with machetes. This is our territory. You can explore this part of the jungle, but not that part of the jungle, for example. You know, but they didn't identify as we're all Cameroonians. That's a European fiction.
There's a sense in which this puts a different spin on the conjectured dynamics of development. right? So one of the ways development's been thought about is in this Robert Keegan sense, that the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage, right? And people might say, well, okay, so there's a very productive thing, and this is what I am now. And by witnessing myself over time, this self becomes something I can act on. I'm now a meta self relative to that self, and that constitutes my new self. And this can keep going, and it sort of builds up through some semi-discrete stages. And then you say, well, what about the obscene supplement? You go, well, of course, you need to be doing some kind of therapy as well as your developmental work. So that's one way to go at it. But we might also look at it and say, and you almost were saying this, that somehow folding in the obscene excess is itself the developmental engine. And that we should think of it more that way and less in the way of this sort of buildup of witnessing and meta regression to infinity.
Yeah, I mean, again, I could just think about like my own. I always try to stay close to myself with these concepts because it allows, I don't know, it helps my thinking. It helps my thinking because we're talking about very complex things, and we're using, I mean, we might even be talking about things which are very rarely touched in a lot of thinking spaces. But if I just think about my own pseudo unity and my own obscene excess for a moment, I would say in some sense that my PhD identity or my academic identity is a type of pseudo unity, and that what I discovered upon the completion of my doctorate was a type of confrontation with my obscene excess, which maybe I unconsciously thought would go away or would be overcome or would be transcended by my meta unity identity of my academic persona. And it's the thing is, it might be that people don't go too much weird dynamic because it's actually quite embarrassing and it's quite emotionally challenging, I found, to go into that, and also it requires a type of deep transformation of the way in which you are ultimately the obscene excess. I think it wants to attach to something, and to detach from it, to detach from it, and to question it, to reflect on it, can have fundamental consequences for your, I mean, how you present and how you manifest in the world. Like, let me give a very practical example now that's coming to me from this reflection, which is the very performative presentation of someone like Alexa Vartman, who ran the New Tantra. That's someone who, by playing with the obscene excess directly, literally presents herself differently in the world from that confrontation. Like, and in her conversations and in her interviews I've listened to, she gives some quite extremely disturbing identity transformations from the point of view of a normie. Like the types of identity transformations she's gone through to present as a woman, I don't think most normal people, so-called, it's not that they don't have contact with that obscene excess. I think they do. It's just that they don't go into it. They don't move through it. They don't figure out what it's saying and what it means for their personal development. So I think if I think about that, if I think about my development in that context, and I think about my obscene excess outside of the academic totality of my persona, that's sort of the level I would want to think that relationship.
That makes me curious about to what degree the process is simply including what hasn't been included, and to what degree is it about specifically including what's being rejected, right? So if I make that personal, I sit down in meditation, now I'm going to try to enfold more of my experience. Now I could be like, okay, well, there's a body, there's a world. I got a list of all the things that exist that aren't currently in my consciousness, and I'm trying to fold them in. That's a different internal procedure than if I go, what am I pushing against right now? Where's the resistance? I'm going to fold that in. I'm not interested in trying to include everything. I'm interested in trying to reverse the action that I'm performing through the resistance.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. If you want to expand on that, I didn't mean to stop your thought.
No, that's fine, because I mean, my thought actually jumped to sociological elements of this again, because I'm thinking about, evolution, social evolution, development, things like that, and the similarity this has to folding externalities into the system, right? So we look at it and say, well, we've got this kind of market economy we're set up, and maybe some of its dynamics work really well, but it's interesting that there's a whole bunch of labor going on that isn't getting paid. It's interesting that there's a whole bunch of ecological and resource realities that aren't being priced in, right? We could say that a lot of our accumulating crises are the crises of certain specific kinds of elements that are being pushed out of the market that could be folded into the market. And if we did that, that might count as, an upgrade in our symbolic order.
Yeah. So like the first example, actually, now the first example that comes to my mind actually does have to do with sexuality, and and then I could build on that. But the resistance in our society, it strikes me has a moral dimension, meaning that morality is often used as a resistance to the folding in of some of these obscene excesses. So like, for example, like if we think about, like, I see a lot of, but they also present ethical conundrums. So like I see, for example, a lot of women who are experimenting with making a living off of things like OnlyFans or sugar daddy relationships. Well, what is OnlyFans and what is sugar daddy relationships are actually the sort of digital, it's sort of like the digital commodification of relationships that have actually been going on as obscene excesses for all of human history. Like there's a common phrase like that. What is it? Prostitutes are the oldest profession in the world, or prostitution is the oldest profession. So this the existence of wealthy older people using their wealth and their experience and their professionalization to have relationships with younger, sort of sexually maturing people is not new, but it's something that's being folded into the market in a digital way now, which is perhaps many people would say obscene. But at the same time, it seems to me that if you just pretend that obscene excess isn't there, it doesn't get rid of it. It's kind of like the same thing with prohibition, like with the logic of prohibition and alcohol. Like if you just prohibit alcohol, like, or the war on drugs is a similar example. Like, but then like what to me what emerges is not like this, like sort of liberal free for all, where like, okay, we can just like all of our relationships can be sugar daddy relationships, and all the women can just try to be OnlyFans entrepreneurs, and like we can, we can just have a, let's just all get drunk and have as many drugs as we like because now everything's legal and it's all government sponsored, whatever. It actually, I think, brings us to deeply ethical, real development problems. Like I would like it if our society would be able to have conversations, mature conversations about these spaces and these energies, which are not sort of, like, for example, yes, like you can really damage yourself if you expose yourself sexually in certain contexts. That could have a really negative impact on your unfoldment as a being. Yes, you could really damage your development by, for example, just drinking constantly, or like having a very open relationship to drugs. At the same time, just prohibiting these things as obscene excesses also doesn't solve the problem. So this is the line, I think, that opens up ethically.
I mean, my first thought is you could really damage yourself by eating processed white bread and drinking Coca-Cola, right? So it's very specific, the areas in which we make these distinctions, because we allow a lot of damaging things to go on with no real social pushback. and
I see that massively in like the difference between what Europeans allow in their grocery store versus what North Americans allow in their grocery store. Like if I go down, I've got a sort of a problem with certain junk food, and when I go down the aisles of certain junk food aisles in North America, like there's a type of explosion of excess there, which is obscene, and I mean, yeah, there do need to be ethical conversations about where the lines are, where the boundaries are here. It's just that, it seems to be these boundary lines are where our deepest joys manifest themselves. Like, take, for example, like a website like ashleymadison.com, which is like, I mean, that website exploded. Like, these are large scale social phenomenons we're talking about. Ashley Madison is like literally a website where I think mostly women are using it to cheat on their husband, or like to have extramarital affairs. I think men and women both use it, but I think it's got this stereotype of being something that women use predominantly. But in any case, like, all of these really taboo subjects are also like the areas where our sort of secret joys manifest themselves, like, and this is where I was saying, like, I get like personally disoriented in these topics because like it's hard to know how to talk about them, specifically as it relates to truth and fiction, and specifically as it relates to like the very joy being mobilized by the boundary. Like the fact that it's not allowed is what brings the joy. Yeah. Like you're transgressing, the very boundary is what you're enjoying, transgressing.
Yeah, it seems like there's two things that are afforded by that boundary. Like I was thinking about the prohibition question, right? If you look at a prohibition, you go, well, why are we criminalizing this substance? Oh, this country decriminalized it and they got way better results. Okay, so do we just not know, right? Is it an act of foolishness, or is it more intentional than that, where we're getting some kind of pleasure and also some kind of group cohesion identity by affording ourselves the opportunity to bully someone or to have a specific transgression? And it's not that we don't understand, it's that we're actively setting it up that way in order to maintain the identity we have and get the pleasures that we want to have. Right. So where do we think it's an organism doing something that makes Darwinian sense for it to do? And where do we think, oh, it's just a misunderstanding, and if we understood it, we would do it differently?
Yeah, this is like the difference between like the it's like this weird relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. And my first thought would be it would have some parallel to what we were talking about before with traversing the fantasy. That it's like the sexuality before you traverse the fantasy and the sexuality after you traverse the fantasy. It's not that in both of those situations you have fantasy mediating sexuality, but it seems like the after condition allows for a more mature relationship. Like, for example, in the kink community or in various tantric communities, it's not that everyone's just having sex with anyone, or even that boundaries aren't playfully explored, and the transgression of boundaries aren't playfully explored. I think they are. The boundaries are set up and boundaries are transgressed, but the way in which that's happening seems to have a different quality to it, seems to have a different order to it. Might have something to do with the unconscious.
Yeah.
Because the pleasure group cohesion thing is like, I know Freud's idea was like the pleasure principle, like that you're sort of governed by the pleasure principle and you try to avoid pain. And so the pleasure group cohesion is the excess where you're getting the cohesion is actually seen as it's usually a pain point. Like that's why there's resistance. It's just that it seems like the unity and the obscene excess we were talking about has some relationship between pleasure and pain. The excess is seen as something painful. Sorry, the obscene excess is perceived as something that's threatening to my current identity. Like that if I was to include that obscene excess into my present identity, it would disturb my pseudo-totality from within. But actually, it constitutes my pseudo-totality.
Well, a thing that comes up for me in thinking about that is the role that folding pain in plays in both in self-development and healthy self-regulation and in overcoming addiction, right? So one of the things you hear from addiction experts is you've got these different reward systems, and if you start to max out the pleasure, your system starts to jack up the pain because they're held in a kind of homeostatic balance. And one of the things that's suggested in terms of breaking an addiction is to lean into discomfort, right? You got to lean into either not having the substance,
Yeah.
but also into exercises, right? You get all Wim Hof on it. You start going to the gym. You start doing things that generate the displeasure. So your brain starts to correct by giving you organic pleasure substances, right? And it seems like that's part and parcel of escaping these weird reciprocal narrowing loops and also giving ourselves the opportunity to continue to evolve and develop. So it might be something around that getting stuck or that getting hacked in a way. It's very interesting in terms of thinking about how you would actually improve a society, because most people's improvement scheme simply seems to be, let's go around and speak conscious mind to conscious mind about how there's a better way. And so often that seems to not create any change, because it doesn't really address the level at which these patterns are instantiated, because they're providing some kind of reward around, obscene pleasure and group cohesion. So I wonder what role leaning into discomfort could play in setting societies loose for potential development to a more sophisticated way of being.
Yeah, man, I think this is pretty deep for me. It's like, that's sort of like my zero level. That's like sort of like where me as a sort of as a performative contradiction, sort of position myself relative to like the meta-intellectual spaces. I kind of fundamentally disagree with the idea that you could just speak conscious mind to conscious mind as a way to create real change, or like as a way to develop. I don't think that's how it works. And like my concrete example for that is like is just when I think about my family relationships. When I think about my family relationships, and when I think about the people who are closest, like to me, like for example, tonight, I'm going to go and spend the evening with my brother. And there's nothing that I can say. There's no information I can go and give him tonight from this meta-intellectual space that will change his very personal problems with certain addictive substances. That the only thing that I can think that would help him as an individual relate to his own concrete existence is something where he has an inner movement where he's willing to lean into extreme discomfort and move through that extreme discomfort, which basically has to do with the release of certain attachments to pleasure, which have become self-undermining. But yeah, I don't know, like that this level is, it seems like it's the level where I, in my own personal life, just start to shake and scream. Like I just like, but like that literally happened. Like that's actually like a principle I have for my personal meditation, is that I'll meditate until my body starts to spontaneously shake. Like usually my legs will start shaking, and then I just let the shaking happen. And then that's sort of like a measure I get for like it's basically a measure I get for like, because like most people have trouble sitting still, right? Like that's the whole thing with meditation, is like if you like watch people who don't meditate very much, they have trouble sitting still. They have to do something just to keep themselves busy. Well, if you meditate, you're sort of trying to keep still. And then sort of like I try to keep myself, I just naturally have a certain level of capacity to be still until I don't, until my body shakes for me.
A lot of the subtle energy traditions work like that, where you deny expression to normal energy release, so then you drive it more deeply into yourself, so it kind of operates at some other level of spontaneous activation. So you get the kriyas and mudras and all these things start to happen. You try to run, the metaphor is you're trying to run more energy through the system than it's currently adapted to handle. So it's got to try to adjust itself. It's something interesting about that thing you were talking about with your brother made me think of a famous story about the first American hypnotherapist, Milton Erickson. Right? There's all these stories about how he sort of miraculously cured people. So one of them is this guy was taken to a number of different therapists, and he was compulsively carrying a cross around all the time, and they couldn't get him to stop doing it. So Milton Erickson talked to this guy for a while and realized this guy wasn't going to give it up. So what he told this guy was, You're absolutely right. In order to be pious, you've got to carry this around. But I've read a lot more than you have, and I can tell you that you have to carry two. It doesn't work if you only carry one. So now they got this guy trying to carry two, right? So he's leaning into more effort, more discomfort, but it's also become more intentional and more complicated than it was before. So rather than trying to tell this guy to change, they've asked this guy to lean further into his own discomfort, but in a way that nuances and complexifies it a little bit, so that maybe that affords some kind of non-immediate, but down the road opening up of what he's doing.
Well, like in a way, like the way I can give a sort of an abstract personal example, and then I could give an example. I was actually watching another example from something I was watching earlier today that relates. I was watching Johnny Depp's trial against Amber Heard. I don't know if you heard about that, but Johnny Depp's in a trial right now with Amber Heard, and he was describing going to rehab and how rehab worked as a relationship to certain pills. Is that basically you have to go through a certain detox where you have to lean into an extreme discomfort and shaking with the substance until it's out of your body, kind of thing. But the other example I could give, which was the other example you were giving about carrying the cross, is that oftentimes people who have alcoholism are often brought to a point where they drink so much that their body actually needs them to keep drinking. So like this is called alcohol seizure, that your body needs you to, you go into a seizure if you're not drinking. So this is where you lead, like, so this, instead of the carrying two crosses, it's like drinking so much that your body needs to keep drinking more than you actually can to survive. And that can be a point where you change. Like, cause you literally, okay, I've got this seizure now condition.
It's very much uncertain what that would look like at the sociological scale. You know, the kind of people who think that maybe it would be better to elect the worst possible president, because at least that would shock us and distress us into some kind of action outside of the stagnancy of the status quo. There's something compelling about that argument. You know, in practice, it doesn't work very well because a worse manager tends to make the conditions worse, which tends to inhibit development and change. But there's a sense in which people recognize the system might need to lean into discomfort somehow. But what the form of that discomfort is, such that it could set the system free for an upgrade, is uncertain, because the ways we typically think about receiving that distress really fit into the, you know, the phantasmatic structure that keeps the system we have going.
Yeah, actually, Zizek got a lot of criticism from the left because he had for, like, he wanted Trump to get elected so that it would be shock and distress the left into a higher order action. It doesn't look like it worked because Biden was elected the next time around. So
no,
I don't know.
I mean, this is one of the things
hard
we do on the
hard
left
to know.
is we tell ourselves this story that there will be the event, and after the event, it will be different, right? After COVID, there's no going back. After Trump, there's no going back. After the moment, then the people will come together and it will be different. But our conception of what that moment is, as needed as it may be, the way we conceive it tends to be something that doesn't change things, and merely the system just rolls on despite those moments. So we may be sensing the kind of distress or shock that is required, but we may be locating it in the wrong places.
I mean, I do think that constitutes that the left does seem to be constituted by this type of what I want to say is like the miscarried event. Like, it's all like the event is always a miscarriage. Mm-hmm. Like it always thinks like there's going to be an event that shakes things up for the you know. Zizek always has the joke about I would sell my mother into slavery to see V for Vendetta 2. You know, like V for Vendetta, the movie where like they blow up the parliament, and he's like, I just want to see V for Vendetta 2. Like, where how do they, you know? I don't know, man. Like it's weird, right? Because brings us back to, like, I think this idea of, can the left think their own obscene excess? Like, because I did say that the left has this idea of a totality as well, like a world historical state beyond capitalism. But can the left think obscene excess? I actually don't think so.
It's very hard when clearly part of their excess is located in their analysis of the people who they see as problematic, and those people are problematic in some ways. But the right, and in particular, sort of populist degenerate streams of the right, and that's the excess of the left to some degree, right? Their inability to feel like they are as bad as those people, let's say.
Yeah. I think, and I have experience with that. I mean, I think, like, there's like, what I get is like comedy from this, because like like, for example, like the right-wing women who are not welcome at the Women's March. Right, like, you get these weird paradoxes internal to the left, where, like, I mean, they do have their own exclusion. They have that when internal to their inclusive view, they have a mode of exclusion.
There was an episode
which becomes quite. Yeah,
I was going to remind me of an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David's trying to avoid people. And he realizes that if he wears a Make America Great Again hat, he can get some free space at restaurants and bars. People stop harassing him because everybody's coming up to him, trying to get him involved in the friendly world of the upperly mobile, wealthy Californians that he knows. So he's found a way to personally fold in that access relative to those people. He knows that they'll find it offensive, and he can therefore profit from it somehow, which is not only what the character does in the show with that hat, but it's what he's done with that show, is sort of sell the obscene excess back to the same people whose obscene excess it is. Sort of like Tyler Durden selling the wealthy fat women back their fat in Fight Club. That's an interesting move.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of fun things to think here. I'm just nothing's immediately coming to my mind.
We've sort of strayed off our main line of discussion, and I've got to drop.
Bring us back home here, Layman.
Yeah, look,
where the hell are we?
We've run through the problem of sexual rapport from a number of different angles. We've seen it in the way evolutionary history is conceived. We've seen it from subject becoming object. We've seen it in actual male-female relations. We've seen it in different kinds of models of how society might develop and how individuals might develop. And we've done all of that while weaving back and forth between theory and some kind of spiritual model of non-dualism that brings some of these things together. So I'm very intrigued by all of that, and we've landed in a place where we want to understand how this works better relative to the socio-political arena, the problems of the left, things like that. And if we do a third one of these at some point, that might be where we want to pick this up. But I think it's been a fantastically arcane conversation. It's very exciting for me to get to talk about these things. I appreciate it very much, and it's always fun to talk with you, Cadell.
Thanks, Layman. Yeah. I guess final thoughts about the sexual relation is, or the sexual non-relation is, for me, there's a way in which current metaphysical thinking focuses on processes and focuses on relations instead of an object-oriented view, which I think is important, and which I think is a way in which new types of thought can emerge. I think what Lacan's introduction of the non-relation does is it allows you to sort of understand the way in which absence, or the way in which the impossible, constitutes the range of possible relations, and that has very practical, intimate consequences when thinking about your own life. So yeah, very, very interesting conversation, and thank you for having me on the integral stage. always happy to have a conversation.